So the usual disclaimer, so whatever is presented here is from me and does not necessarily reflect any of the agencies that are in this room. So the plan of this, the session, so I will be discussing, as I said, the population estimate methods. 80% of them you know, probably 100%. So going through the methodology we know. And then at the end, the idea is to have some time at the end, maybe after, depend how much the discussion takes, but after the discussion have some time to go, I have a form which I'm gonna circulate, and then each table, so country is gonna stay together, and then they're gonna try to reflect on the form. So basically we will discuss the form when I get there, but it's basically to try to know what is the population, special population situation in the country. So this is specifically the plan for the first part, which is then I'm gonna just do the traditional, what I call traditional methods. Then I'm gonna just briefly touch, just mention the micro-censuses. I understand that at the last day you will be a more in-depth session on microplanning, which is linked to this micro-census. And then we're gonna look at some of what I call enhanced method, which is basically just using satellite imageries. So just to make sure that we are all on the same line, I think at this point we have defined the population we are defining as special population, so the transient, the refugees, and the urban street population. I am not going to address the population specifically by saying refugees are solved by this method, because what happened is the method can solve part of combined situation, part of the situation, etc. So depending on the situation, you might use a combination of methods to solve a specific problem, or use a method to solve part of a special situation problem. But I just wanted to remind what the things are. Here we are talking about data. So one thing is to try to gather data to try to have some kind of a baseline. We can collect our own data and try to set some baseline where the situation is. We can try to gather information that exists out there to try to know where the situation is. So I just try to look at here in the region some places where I can find data. And this is one report that is produced by this organization, International Displacement Monitoring Center, which is part of Norwegian Refugee Council. And they produce this, I believe, every year, at least last year. This year they produce it with the World Bank. And they have some data about the, the displaced populations. And now I realize that my graphs are the front is small. So this just shows the recent displacement they found in 2016, and then they show countries with the level of new people displaced. And here I just wanted to point that a couple of countries, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, etc., are in this region. So we kind of know the picture here that some of the level of the situation here. But really the point here is that try to gather information to try to triangulate and see, try to define your population in terms of evidence. Here is another map by the European Union, where they show a little bit graphically, I find it nice, the situation of the refugees around Syria. So the people, there are about 7 million. So here you can see the legend. So Syrian displaced, internal, and then the Syrian that are refugees in the neighboring countries. So the lighter colors. So you can see 1.8 million in Turkey, 1.1 million in Lebanon, and so on. So these are numbers that they estimated for August 15. So there are numbers out there that usually at the national level that can give an idea of maybe what is the level of the situation. Now I'm going to go into what I call the traditional methods. So the traditional methods, as we know them, so the censuses and the surveys, these methods have been around forever. They can solve many issues, but they are not sufficient to do to solve all the problems. But what is important here is to try to use them at the maximum of their potential, right? So whatever data we have, we should try to use them at the maximum of their potential. So the census try to enumerate all units in a given population. The way it's done is very different, but the general idea is to enumerate all the units. Survey, because censuses are very expensive and take extremely long time to do, surveys are scientific way to take a portion and then still have to say about the total population. So instead of taking all the population, to know the coverage of the kids, basically we don't need to ask every single kids or every single caregiver if the kids was vaccinated. If we take a portion of it, we can have an estimate of the global population. And we have the common one maybe that as immunization program, maybe we know the most. DHS makes an EPI surveys, but there are many of those. So I wanted to point here to a guide by WHO. It's a draft version from November that gives guidelines on denominator estimation. So if you are interested in the mathematical models, how surviving infants are derived from birth and how projections, etc., what's all the mathematical logic behind, they give a nice summary about those methods. So I give the link here so people can look at it. Here I will try to concentrate on the concept and the ideas rather than the mathematical notions. So I went online and looked up the countries in the region, MENA region, UNICEF MENA region, and tried to see when was the last time the census was conducted. I hope I did not make any mistakes. So this is information I gathered from internet. And then you can see that there are a couple of countries here that did not have a survey for more than 10 years. And I think I had a country that was maybe 1932, something like that, a long time ago. And then the point here is that surveys are done at the national level, and data become, because of population change and growth and mortality and everything, become rapidly old, right? So the point here is that this is just a rule of thumb, but if a census is less than 5 years, you can consider it more or less recent. If it's between 5 and 10, it's old. And if it's more than 10, it's very old. And now that depends on the situation of the country. If there's a lot of movement in a country, if there are special situations, if there are migration, etc., that can be even rapidly more old than these numbers can tell. And at the subnational level, the data become even more unstable because things like building new habitations or tearing down habitation to build a commercial complex, for example, can change from 1 year to the next, the situation very, very differently. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, Jordan is not, yeah? No, Jordan is green, less than 5. Yeah. Jordan is less than 5. So I go here through this basic step for a census. What is important for us to take away here is the partitions of the country. So what they will do to run a census, they will divide the country in what they call census block, or sometimes enumeration areas, depend on the countries. So the blocks here, they are exclusive, so they're not intersecting, so they're touching but not intersecting, and they cover the entire country. So the point here is they cover the entire country. So whatever portion in the country should be in one of these census blocks, right? And then the census blocks are made in a way that an interviewer, a surveyor can deal with the census block for the census. So they don't make them too big, they don't make them too small because they want the guy to work, but they don't make them too big either. There are rules usually, for example, they say around 300 households, it depends. But the point there is to have something manageable by an interview, right? And then they go in each block, they try to enumerate the people or the household or other units, depending on what the census is about. So for our concern, they go in there and they try to enumerate all the households and all the people who live there. And then they collect socio-demographic information. So information about the household, how many people live in the household, how many rooms, age, demographics, etc. And so that's going to constitute the census, right? And then you have data processing and the other guys to do the census. So this is an example of census block. So you see that the red are the frontier, and then, so this is a census block, this is a census block, etc. And then you can see the size are different because this is less populous than this one, so to do this one, you need to circulate longer, so to have the same population than this. So the size is not necessarily the same in terms of area, but in general, in terms of people or in terms of household, they try to make them more or less as possible similar. But over time, this is going to change, but as the time of the census, that's what they try to do. So here I pull up one of the definition of the census, and this is from Jordan, 2004. The idea here is first to show that we are interested in special population, so to show that really the census is focused on household, right? And that may not be the best thing for us, but that's what it is. And also to show that, looked at the length of the definition of a private household. So this to show that they try to go in depth to try to be as rigorous as they can to make the data comparable, to make the data good quality, and so on and so forth. So really the theme I want here for us to have is to try to pursue that quality and to try to get the most we can from what we know how to do already before even we try to go further. So I looked at the information from Jordan 2015, and then I realized that they had, so usually a census is short. They try to make it as short as possible because it takes a lot of time to conduct. A census, for example, in Canada, they do it every 5 years, and as soon as they finish one, they start preparing for the next one. And it takes them 3 or 4 years to get to the survey, to the census, and then after the census, it takes another 1-2 years to publish the entire data. So you can say that it takes 5 to 7 years to run for them a survey, census, sorry. So because of that, the information they put in the questionnaire is very short. They're not going to ask a long questionnaire because they're going in every household. Now there are versions of this, what I call here the long and the short form. Some countries use a long form which contain more questions than the shorter. The shorter one is just basic information, which they run through everybody to know age, for example, sex. And the longer one is they have more questions, which they run to a subset of households to try to deal with this issue. So for Jordan, what I want to point here is that they adapt to the situation and they added questions about refugees because they figure out that this is a problem now, maybe, or at least they want to know what's going on. So here I show the form for Jordan. So you can see here is just the enumeration where they put the governorate, the district, etc. So identification more. And then here you have the information about what they take, birthday, for example, relation to the house of religion, nationality. And they have questions where the person was staying to know how long he stayed in the country. And then they have questions about the refugees. So date where the person arrived to Jordan, and et cetera, et cetera. So my point here is there is some information. So I'm going to let you comment. So my point is there's a little information on the asylum situation in Jordan. So I wonder if you take advantage of it as EPI.
No, I want to add something. In the next step, we will add questions related to vaccines. Now we have a team from the Ministry of Health, Immunization Department. He joined with the census team that will prepare for the next census data. We will add something about vaccines to collect data about vaccination.
So you want to add vaccination question in the next census?
Yes.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. That's yeah, you wanted to come?
Nabil is a part of.
So did you use this information? For example, one use of this information can be to try to talk to the Ministry or the Department of Statistics and try to have these numbers by district, for example. I don't know if they would give it, but I assume they would. But to try to talk to them to see whether in the areas where you have concerns, what these numbers looks like. And that can be a benchmark that you can use for 2015 and say, in this district, assuming to census, can be correct or not, but assuming to census, we have X asylum there. And then from there, you can do other methods to try to move on or improve the numbers, etc. So the presentation will be available in the Dropbox, so everybody will have it. So I wasn't trying to show anything. I would have preferred to make it clear here, the front. But the point here, I just wanted to emphasize that some information was available about the refugees at the census, meaning in every single district, every single census block, and then maybe working with Department of Statistics can make these numbers available. And then I pulled this table from the Department of Statistics, and then they put the number of refugees by age group, and then you can see maybe this is the line that maybe you are most interested in. Less than 1 year, how many are in, is it Balka, Amman, and the total, all the country. So for all the country, about 36,500 refugees, less than 1 year. And then they have other age group here, and then they have the numbers. So a table like this, maybe, I don't know, but maybe you can talk to them, collaborate, see whether you can have more information about these numbers by some other disaggregation that that would be useful for you. I realize that this is a typo. It's still 15, actually. So some of the limitation of census. So have high cost, so very expensive, depend on the country, of course. In US, I think in 2000, they evaluated about 4.5 billion, the census, which is extremely expensive, but it's dependent on the countries, and take time to run. So by the time you get the information is almost old already. And in terms of logistic and resources, including human resources, it's a big effort. Now, they're coming to the new age where they're trying to do things in satellite, in internet, telephone. The questionnaire, they can have a machine that read the answers automatically rather than a person checking in, etc. So it's faster. Some countries now have registries. For example, North European country, they don't go to household to ask them questions. All their citizens are registered by a number, which they have the information more easily. Has its problems, but much cheaper to run than a traditional census. But the point here is where we are, most countries where they are, including the US, is still mostly traditional and mostly expensive and take time. So that gets us to the next method. So this one takes too long and too expensive and etc. They advise to do it every 10 years, but as you can see, as you saw in the map, many countries haven't done it for more than 10 years. So the surveys is another cheaper option than the census, and that's just take a sample and generalize the results to the entire population, right? So you take a subset of the population and you come up with an answer for everything, which is actually fantastic. But now to get to that point, you need to follow sampling procedures that are rigorous. So the main point here, or the main concept for a survey to be generalizable to the population, you need to have a frame. So you need to account for all the units in the target population you wanna do an inference for, right? You need a random process to select, and you need the probability to be known. You need them to be known because that will allow you to calculate the weights later. If you don't know them, you cannot calculate weights. So because you know them and you know the process, how you generate the sample, you can weight the sample. And really the weighting scheme here is important because that's the weighting that's going to allow you to extrapolate to the population. So in simple interpretation, a weight means if I select you, how many other people you represent in the sample. So I select you, I give you a weight of 100, so I say you represent 100 people in the entire population. So if I don't give you that weight of 100, it's like I'm considering that you represent only yourself. Now there are special situations where if the weight is the same for everybody, for point estimate you can get rid of the weight because it's the same for everybody. You won't change anything adding it or not for the point estimate. But still for confidence interval and stuff, you need to have the weight properly accounted for. So that gets us to the new WHO guidelines. So since 2015, WHO have issued a draft version of the new vaccination coverage survey, which tried to take advantage of the rigor of the statistical rules to make the sample generalizable to the population. So you remember, to do that, we need to have a frame. We need to select everybody from a frame. We need the process to be random. We need to know the probability we selected it from, and we need to weight the sample, all right? So that's what the new guide is after. So trying to generate better data, using statistical methodology, to be able then, the idea here is then when you have your sample at the end of the day, you can say this sample estimated that in my entire population, in Jordan, for example, the coverage is X%. If you don't follow this, you cannot do that generalization. So you cannot just select a sample, use whatever methodology you want, and at the end, try to generalize it to the population. There are rules that you need to follow for that. So I took some of the recommendations, the one maybe that are more relevant for us here in terms of estimating the population. There are other ones that maybe I did not include here. So this does not change much. So it's a cluster sampling methodology, meaning that you start by a cluster, by a group of households. You select a group of households first, and then in a second stage, you select households. So that's the clustering part. You put households together. So it can be, in our case, going to be census block. So you start by selecting a census block, and then you go into the census block, you select households. Remember, I said at the beginning, they may advise around 300. So say a census block have 300 households. You select a census block, you have 300 households. Then you need to go inside there and select maybe you want 30. So you go inside there and select 30 among the 300, right? So that's what the clustering means here. This number 2 is probably the most important part in terms of making it probability compliant, to be able to generalize it to the population. So what happened here is, first of all, we need a frame that represents everybody. So because we don't have a frame of kids directly, we don't have a list of kids from which we can select, what we start to do is we select a list of blocks, census block, that we have, right? The country is divided in lists of census blocks. The country have all the census blocks that cover the entire country. So we select those. Let's say we select 200, 300, 500, we select a number. The number B here, when we select a census block, the number we get from the census is the number they had by the time of the census. When they were conducting the census, the government said in this block, we had 300 households. That may be 5 years ago, that may be 4 years ago, that may be 10 years ago, that may be 30 years ago. That's what the government had at that time. So we cannot just come, especially if the census is old, and then assume it's 300 and just select 30 out of 300. Because now maybe the number is 100, maybe it's 600, maybe it's 500. So that's why we do the updating here. By updating, we update our frame, so now we cover everybody. If we use the 300 and there are 10 more, those 10 more, it's like they are not covered by our survey. So to make sure that we are up to date, we come here and then we update the listing. So what this line means is that after we selected a census block, we send somebody there and he do what we call a line listing, or a listing or a census of the household in the blocks. So he lists all the household there and then come up with a new number. And then from that number, we select the number of household we want. Another important part of the new methodology is to try to capture the barriers for vaccination, and other useful information can be for equity. In this region, maybe to add, somebody was commenting that we have all this survey, but we don't have any information about refugees. Maybe in the next EPI survey, maybe we can think of how we can incorporate those kind of questions in our survey. Here is to know why the mother has not vaccinated the kid, or even if she has vaccinated the kids, what are the difficulties to vaccinating? Maybe it took a lot of effort to vaccinate. Maybe next time she won't do it. So we need to try to understand what is the situation as much as we can from the survey, and then to try to address them in the program later. And here I will really emphasize this point, because DHS and MIX, they are not coverage surveys. or they are not immunization coverage survey. They run many indicators, and they have this little space for immunization. So the next point is the selection of household. The selection of household, we need to remove all bias at the selection stage. We cannot ask an interviewer to select the sample because the interviewer might find it difficult to go across the river or to climb a hill or to go to a household that have a dog or something. So they may, in his selection or her selection, she may be biased on how she choose the household that she put or he put in the sample. So we cannot leave that to convenience. We need to make it a random process. So because of that, from the list of all the households in the cluster, we select randomly the number we want, right? If the household happen to be the top of the mountain, so be it, we're gonna go up there, right? That's because we don't want a bias in the selection. And usually, the bias that the interviewer applied to select a household, that same bias is gonna be the one that's gonna be applied when it's gonna come to the time of vaccination. Maybe it's the remote place, maybe it's a difficult place to reach, maybe it's the heart, maybe it's a community that does not particularly like surveys or vaccinations of us, etc., right? So we need to avoid those type of situations. So that's why we need to pre-select. And that's a step that's going to address partially the difficult population to reach. For example, if it's a pygmy community that is isolated, that the interviewer don't want to go there because of X, Y, Z, if it's in the cluster, we select a household there, then we have to go there. And then we try to negotiate, do some communication, some explanations, etc., to try to make them respond to our survey, okay? And that's gonna help us reduce the bias of reaching some communities because they're far or because they're inaccessible or because that's not a guarantee because even if we go there, they might still refuse to participate. So that's why interviewing people, it's not just about data. It's about communication, it's about telling people why it's important to get vaccinated. It's about all these other things that we do to make sure that the program works, okay? But the point there is we can solve part of the hard to reach situation by by doing it properly. Then we calculate the weight that come up from this process, and then we can do analyzing using the weights. Okay? Any questions?
The last point regarding the random, when we do the random sample and to choose here some houses, if some house as you said hard to reach for some reasons, what can we do معاي?
Yeah.
Or from the beginning we must not enter these hard to reach houses in the table.
No. We do not replace households that don't want to participate. What we do is we inflate the sample. If we need 20, we take maybe 23, so that when we lose, we come back to the number we want. So we inflate the sample a little bit. But what we do really is that before the sample, before the collection of the data, we try to go to the community, talk to leaders, talk to people, community outreach, try to have a guide within the community to sensitize the people in the community about the survey so that when it comes the time to do the survey, they're more willing to do the survey. So we do everything we can prior to collecting the information so that we ensure their participation, all right? So that we have the, so that's the new methodology. This is basically some more explanation about it. So surveys are not perfect. There are some limitations. So they may not be appropriate for strict populations because survey really rely on households. So if there's a population that is not in households, you cannot capture it here. Now, strict population in most countries, at least at the national level, is maybe not going to change the national number. But at local level, it can change the number, right? The cost, even though it's much cheaper than census, it's still very expensive for most API programs. So we ask information about the 12 to 23. So we have, and by the time we release the survey, there is a delay there. We rely on home-based recall to collect the information. So if the parents don't have their cards, we rely on recall. And we know all the issues around reporting, remembering the immunization time, dates, etc. Right? And when we disaggregate, there are limits. Usually we have it at the national and the regional level. Below that is very difficult to have estimate. And lastly, something I didn't put here, but I want to emphasize, surveys are not routine tools. We should not be using surveys every year to know what is the coverage is. That's not the point of a survey. The survey is something we do at point of time to try to check what the coverage is, right? So I'm going to go rapidly onto the microcensus. So microcensus, I really think for special problems where you have very difficult situation localized in areas, I think that microcensus is one of the most probably effective ways of knowing what your population is. So you go there, you rely on local people, and you try to make sure that you have the boundaries correct, and then you enumerate everyone. At the last day, they will be more on the microplanning. They will be talking more about this situation. But I think we need to keep an eye on this methodology that we already have that we may not be utilizing fully. Okay? So this is just an example of reporting tool they use for micro sensing. And then, so you can see here, you have the household, the people, and then who was vaccinated, who is not, then they come back and vaccinate. Right? So this is just an aggregation. So the problem here is because line listing is very expensive, so we can use other methods to try to supplement line listing. And those methods are usually technology. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about satellite imageries. And here I took the example of Nigeria. So I thank BMGF for sharing the information. So what they did here is 2012, you see polio cases, they had polio cases. And even though they were on paper vaccinating everybody, but they still have cases. Then later they figured out that actually the maps that was available were not covering the entire. They were not precise and were leaving some blind spot in the area, right? And for example, here the census say this is the number, and then when they have the satellite image, they see that the number is very different, right? So the way that you do the GIS thing is you get a basic map, and then they send people to collect extra information about things of interest that can relate to EPI, for example, schools for kids, etc. And they add layers to the map, right? And then they use the map to classify areas in terms of the topology. So you can see more dense urban situations. So these 6 are urban situations. One that is more like maybe a richer area. This is more like a regular, etc. So this is maybe more like a slum or urban dense situation. And this is, for example, an example of rural situation where we have a very scattered household. So all M means is the same type because it wasn't very different between them, right? And then they did a microsensing, try to capture the density of the population, and use the satellite imagery. Every of these cells, there's a number there, 123, 70, etc. They come up with a model estimate. They give them the number of people or in these cells, or number of households. But to do this, they did a microsensing of part of the area, selecting clusters. They did a microcensus, and then they use a model that trained. So these are the machine learning models. So you use the data you have on a small set, and then you train the data to recognize households, and then after you train the machine, can look at other pictures and recognize household. So that's what is called supervised learning. So the machine, you just give it, for example, this subset, you scatter the subset, but you give it a subset, and then he can predict the entire area. So they did that for the northern Nigeria, and then they come up with an estimate that the government was missing, government estimate at the state level was missing 10 to 25, or different from the estimate 10 to 25. And that, they decided it was good enough, because at the state level, it was 10 to 25. But at the sub-state level, it was even larger than this. So the decision was that it was stable or accurate at the state level, but at the sub-state level, the data was not accurate. So they used their data to improve the population estimate. So this is an example of use, but a way you can use this, if you know nomads itinerary, you can track it with satellite imageries, for example. But that's required that you do some prior work to try to understand where they're going. You can use this as here for urban population, where a survey can capture the urban situation, but the difficulty of urban is that people usually, or the extreme urban cases, they are not often home, they work, when you come, you cannot get them. So even if you select the household, you may not get the answer from the people. So if you don't get an answer from, say, the richest people, then your estimate may be biased, right? And some urban situations, they don't answer, not because they're slum or they're not there, but just because they don't want somebody to burden them in their household. So that's the upper class, right? So this is a dashboard that they developed. So you can pick what you want in terms of layers. You can pick the area, latitude length of the area, so around a catchment area, for example. You can pick the age group you want, and then they can provide the estimate of the area. So again, this is kind of tool that after you initially developed the system of the satellite imagery is where you have a good estimate with machine trained. You can have a system like this maybe where you can, for a given area, you can go and see what is my population, and from time to time you maintain the data to keep accuracy, right? So this is similar example, another example of GIS use from Facebook, Columbia University, and the World Bank. So Facebook, they have building high dimension images from buildings. So Columbia University used them with census data to come up with model to estimate population. Then they give it to the World Bank to go on the field and try to validate the data. And if the model is off, they try to correct the model, right? So these are other examples. So I'm trying to give here examples that people can consider. So these are grid population estimate of the world. You can go and pick your catchment area or your district or something, and then they estimate the population that are in that area. They're doing it, World Pop is doing similar thing with different resolutions, and then you have another side that's doing it for urban population. And this is an example of a paper that was recently published where they use this grid and they try to reproduce DHS survey in Rwanda. So they try to reproduce the data by using this to show that the data can be usable, okay? So these data are in the early stages. They may not be accurate everywhere. We need to be careful how we use them. I would say always validate them by some type of micro census to try to see whether the data is too off or not, and triangulate it with census data, etc. But these are other options that we can look at to try to know our population. And then I just list here some limits of modeling. And the most probably is the fact that the errors are difficult to estimate, and the fact that often we don't know what the model is doing. We just have the numbers at the end, but we don't know what is behind the model, all right? So we should use this with cautions. So, yeah.
Now maybe before going to the breakout, I want to open the floor for questions, comments from the participants, because it's true that it's quite exhaustive explanations. So any question and comments? I know it's like time for digestion, but colleagues, any? Take the mic. Front of you. Front of you.
Just thank you, Mamadou. Just to make sure that I guess I get it. The first two methodologies you covered in terms of census and survey, and then the enhanced methodologies that you mentioned. I suppose if it would be good if we could have a summary as to how the traditional methods, I suppose also the enhanced methods in terms of the mathematical sort of, how do you say, formula or, you know, tools that we have available can be applied to the special populations that we are all struggling with in this region, the refugees, the IDP, the transient, the urban, and what have you. So maybe one quick summary of this, just to, I guess, put us in the right frame of mind.
Yeah, thank you for the question. What usually you do in terms of sampling to try to cover for a population that is difficult is to do oversampling. So what you do is you look at a population that is not easily represented on your sample because of high rates because they refuse to participate, because they hard to reach, because etc. Then you increase their presence in the sample so that when you lose, you still left with enough units to do the estimate. Now behind that you have methods to do the mathematical adjustment to make sure that at the end, the sample you left at the end is representative of the whole. But for that, there is a main point. The main point is at the beginning, whatever is your target population, that group need to be in the target population. If your target population in here, basically to simplify, we're going to say it's household. If you're trying to do estimation of street populations, they are not there, right? Now, for those kind of specific situations, there are specific methods. There are specific methods to do street population. There are specific methods, for example, to do hard to reach in a term. For example, that's not our concern here, but some people don't want to answer to a question because, for example, you're asking them whether they have HIV. They might refuse to answer that question. So that has to reach, because even if you have them there, they're not going to give you the sample. So there are methods for that, specific methods for that. And most often, they are not even probabilistic. They are non-probabilistic, but they do a proxy to make it probabilistic. But those are, for example, street situations is, you might beat me for saying this, but at the overall picture, it may be so small that maybe it's not necessarily to go with the whole survey to capture those. Maybe we can do things like micro-censusing, going in the area and try to see whether these people stay and try to talk to them and vaccinate them, rather than trying to answer that question by a survey. But everything that is urban situation, for example, one way to do it is that, for example, in the news guidelines, in the old guidelines, or in the way the old guidelines were implemented is, you select a household, you get there, nobody answer, you remove the household, you go to the next one. So that's what happened is, you're gonna miss all the urban or the difficult urban ones, because you're not gonna come back, basically. You knock to the door, they're not there, you don't come. But for this methodology, to reach those difficult population, you take appointments. So you say, when is the person coming? They say, oh, it's an urban person, he worked the day, he comes the night. So you try to get an appointment the weekend or after 8 or something to try to reach that person. Okay? So many of the situations that can be solved by better practices and better implementation of the methodology, right? Rather than extreme. And the nomads, for example, what I say is, if you know the routes, you can capture the routes and satellite imageries to try to follow and estimate the path. But even if you don't have that, let's say you have the census blocks as your frame, doing the current methodology or the revised methodology. What I said was the census covered the entire country. So you're going to select refugee camps. The point there is you include them in your survey. You don't say, I selected a refugee camp, so I'm going to drop it. So if you select your census block and in a camp, refugee camp, you go there and then you do your line listing, you update the list. So in the original list that the government gives you, there were no camp because maybe by the time they did it, there were no camp. Or maybe in their list they didn't include refugees because that's what they do. Now when you come to your survey, you select that because it has a probability of being selected. So it is in your target population. You select that camp, you list people there, and you interview them. So you have reached those populations that are difficult to reach. So many of the situations, you can solve them by using better use or rigorous use of the method that we already have.